The sun had barely risen over the vast lands of the Ottoman Empire when the weight of history pressed down on young Suleiman. The empire he inherited was already a force to be reckoned with, stretching across 3 continents, controlling the most important trade routes, and dominating the Muslim world. But for Suleiman, it was not enough. He was not merely content with ruling an empire, he envisioned one that would surpass all before it. His ambitions were clear from the start. Europe would not be allowed to grow stronger while the Ottomans remained on its borders. He would take the fight to them. Before Suleiman's rise, Europe was fractured, its kingdoms embroiled in internal conflicts and religious strife. The Holy Roman Empire, led by Charles V, was the dominant Christian power, but it was far from united. France, under Francis I, was locked in bitter wars against the Habsburgs, while England remained preoccupied with its own political struggles. To the east, Hungary acted as a buffer state between the Christian and Muslim worlds, a last line of defense before the Ottomans could reach deeper into Europe. But Hungary was vulnerable, divided by internal rivalries and poorly prepared for what was coming. Suleiman's ascension in 1520 marked the beginning of an era where the Ottomans would push farther into Europe than ever before. Unlike his predecessors, he was not just a warrior, he was a ruler with a grand strategy. He understood that power was not won through sheer military might alone. Diplomacy, alliances, and carefully timed campaigns would be just as crucial. The European courts underestimated him at first, seeing him as a young, untested ruler. They would soon realize their mistake. His first target was Hungary. A kingdom that had once stood strong against the Ottomans was now a shadow of its former self, its leaders unprepared for the storm that was about to descend upon them. The Hungarians had resisted Ottoman rule for years, but their defenses were weakening, and their allies were too distracted to come to their aid. Suleiman saw an opportunity and seized it. The conquest of Belgrade in 1521 sent shockwaves through Europe. The fortress, once thought to be an impenetrable barrier, had fallen swiftly, proving the might of Suleiman's armies. This was not just a victory, it was a statement. The Ottomans were coming, and they were unstoppable. With Belgrade under his control, the road to Hungary lay open. But Suleiman's ambitions did not stop there. He had his eyes set on something even greater, the city that had once stood as the heart of Christendom, Vienna. If Vienna fell, the Ottomans would have a direct path into the heart of Europe. The Habsburgs, already struggling to maintain their vast empire, would be forced to defend their capital at all costs. It was a bold move, one that could change the course of history forever. Yet, conquest alone was not Suleiman's only weapon. He understood the power of alliances. France, locked in its rivalry with the Holy Roman Empire, found an unexpected ally in the Ottomans. Francis I, desperate to counter Charles V, reached out to Suleiman, forming an alliance that shocked the Christian world. It was an unprecedented move, a Catholic king working with a Muslim sultan. But in the game of power, religion often took a backseat to politics. As Europe braced itself for war, Suleiman prepared for his most ambitious campaigns yet. The battles that followed would test the strength of empires, shape the fate of nations, and determine whether the Ottomans could truly claim dominance over Europe. The world was watching, and history was about to be written in blood and fire. In the summer of 1521, as Ottoman banners fluttered over the recently conquered Belgrade, the tremors of Suleiman's ambitions were already reaching Hungary. The kingdom had long been a buffer between the Ottomans and the rest of Christian Europe, but by the early 16th century, it was a kingdom in decline. Political instability, a weak monarchy, and internal divisions had left Hungary vulnerable. And Suleiman, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity too great to ignore. Hungary's King Louis II was young and inexperienced, relying heavily on his nobles to maintain control. However, the Hungarian aristocracy was more concerned with its own wealth and power than with preparing for the Ottoman threat. While the warning signs had been clear, previous Ottoman incursions, the fall of Belgrade, the Hungarian court remained paralyzed by indecision. They hoped that their traditional allies, the Pope and the Habsburgs, would intervene when the time came. But Suleiman was not going to give them time to prepare. By 1526, the Ottoman army was on the move, marching toward the heart of Hungary. It was a force unlike anything the Hungarians had ever faced. Suleiman's army was vast, disciplined, and well-equipped. Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, moved with precision, while the heavy artillery, some of the most advanced in the world, rolled toward their next target. The Ottomans had perfected the art of siege warfare, and the Hungarian defenses were nowhere near strong enough to hold them back. As the Ottoman forces approached, Louis II finally gathered an army to meet them. The two sides clashed at the Battle of Mohacs on August 29, 1526, a battle that would decide the fate of Hungary. The Hungarian army, though courageous, was vastly outnumbered. Within hours, the battle turned into a massacre. The Ottoman cavalry encircled the Hungarian forces, cutting off any chance of retreat. King Louis himself was among those who perished, drowning while attempting to escape across a river. With his death, Hungary was left leaderless, and its kingdom effectively collapsed. For Suleiman, the victory at Mohacs was not just a military success, it was a political triumph. Hungary, the great barrier between the Ottomans and the rest of Europe, had fallen. The road to Vienna was now open. But controlling Hungary would not be so simple. With Louis II dead, a power struggle erupted between rival factions. The Habsburgs, who claimed the Hungarian throne through marriage, moved quickly to assert their influence. Meanwhile, the Ottomans installed their own candidate, John Zapolya, as King of Hungary. The stage was set for years of conflict, as Hungary became a battleground between two empires. Despite the decisive victory at Mohacs, Suleiman understood that a more significant challenge lay ahead. The heart of the Habsburg lands, Vienna, stood as the next major prize. If Vienna fell, the Ottoman Empire would have a direct path into Western Europe. In 1529, Suleiman led his forces toward the city, beginning one of the most famous sieges in history. The siege of Vienna was the first true test of Ottoman strength against the Habsburgs. Unlike the ill-prepared Hungarian forces, the defenders of Vienna were well-trained and determined. The city's walls were formidable, and the defenders had the advantage of European military technology. Despite relentless Ottoman assaults and bombardments, Vienna held firm. The harsh autumn rains and logistical challenges eventually forced Suleiman to withdraw, marking the first major setback of his European campaigns. Though Vienna remained unconquered, the Ottoman presence in Central Europe was now undeniable. Hungary was effectively under Ottoman influence, and the Habsburgs were forced into a defensive position. Suleiman had proven that the Ottomans were no longer a distant eastern threat, they were a dominant force on the European stage. As the 1530s began, the fight for Hungary was far from over. The battle lines between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs had been drawn, setting the stage for decades of warfare. But for Suleiman, Hungary had already served its purpose. It had opened the door for the greatest conflict of his reign, the long and bitter struggle against the Holy Roman Empire. As the Ottoman banners dominated the land, another battlefield emerged, one where dominance meant control of wealth, trade, and power. The Mediterranean, once a playground for European maritime empires, was now a contested battleground between the Ottomans and the Christian powers of the West. Suleiman understood that controlling the sea was just as crucial as conquering land. But the Ottoman navy was still growing, and it needed a leader who could challenge the supremacy of European fleets. That leader came in the form of Hayreddin Barbarossa, a name that sent shivers down the spines of European sailors. A feared corsair turned admiral, Barbarossa had already built a reputation as an unstoppable force in North Africa. Suleiman recognized his potential and, in 1533, appointed him as the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Navy. This single decision transformed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The most immediate threat to Ottoman naval ambitions was the Holy League, a coalition of Christian powers led by Spain and Venice, with backing from the papacy. Their fleets were vast and experienced, having dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. But Barbarossa was not deterred. Under his command, the Ottoman navy rapidly expanded, fortifying key ports, building powerful galleys, and implementing advanced naval strategies that had rarely been seen before. In 1534, Barbarossa launched a campaign against the North African coast, seizing Tunis from the Spanish-backed Hafsid dynasty. This bold move alarmed Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe, who personally led a massive fleet to retake Tunis in 1535. While the city was reclaimed, it did little to stop the growing Ottoman naval strength. Barbarossa, ever the strategist, simply shifted his focus elsewhere, continuing to raid and expand Ottoman influence. The real test of Ottoman naval power came in 1538 at the Battle of Preveza. This was not just a battle, it was a defining moment in Mediterranean history. The Holy League, led by the renowned Genoese admiral Andrea Doria, assembled a formidable fleet to crush the Ottomans once and for all. But Barbarossa had no intention of fighting on their terms. Instead of engaging in a traditional naval battle, he used speed, deception, and superior maneuvering to outwit the Holy League. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the Christian fleet, securing Ottoman dominance over the eastern Mediterranean for decades to come. With the Holy League weakened, Suleiman's navy became an unstoppable force. The Ottomans now controlled key islands, including Rhodes and much of the Aegean, while also extending their influence into the western Mediterranean. Barbarossa continued his raids along the coasts of Italy and Spain, striking fear into Christian kingdoms. Even the once mighty Venice was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, acknowledging Ottoman supremacy at sea. Yet, the conflict was far from over. Charles V, unwilling to accept defeat, sought revenge. His dream of reclaiming North Africa led to another campaign, this time against Algiers in 1541. However, nature had its own plans. A sudden storm wrecked much of his fleet, turning the campaign into a disaster. The Ottomans, seizing the opportunity, strengthened their grip on the region. By the 1540s, Suleiman's navy had become the dominant force in the Mediterranean. No longer were the Ottomans just a land empire, they were now a maritime power, rivaling even the greatest European fleets. Ports that once belonged to Venice and Spain now flew the Ottoman flag. European merchants had to pay heavy tolls to sail through Ottoman-controlled waters, enriching the empire's coffers. Despite these victories, the struggle for naval dominance never truly ended. Even after Barbarossa's death in 1546, his legacy continued, with Ottoman admirals maintaining control over crucial sea routes. However, the Christian powers were learning. They began adapting their strategies, building stronger fleets, and preparing for future confrontations. This tension would eventually culminate in later battles, but for now, the Mediterranean belonged to Suleiman. The naval wars against the Holy League proved that Suleiman's ambitions were not limited to land. His empire was now a two-front power, capable of dominating both land and sea. As the Ottomans looked westward, the struggle against the Habsburgs would continue, but now, with the added advantage of controlling the vital trade routes that connected Europe, Africa, and Asia. As the dust settled over Vienna and the Mediterranean waves carried the echoes of Ottoman victories, a new battlefield emerged, one that would define European geopolitics for decades. The conflict between Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and the Habsburg dynasty was not just a war for land, it was a war for supremacy, a contest between two empires that sought to dominate Europe. The Habsburgs, led by Charles V and later his brother Ferdinand I, were the greatest rivals the Ottomans had faced in the West. Their struggle would shape the borders of the continent for centuries. The Habsburg Empire was vast, stretching from Spain to Austria, with strongholds in Italy, the Low Countries, and the New World. But despite its size, it was not an unbreakable force. The empire was fragmented, constantly at war with France, struggling to control rebellious Protestant states, and dealing with Ottoman pressure from the east. Suleiman recognized these weaknesses and sought to exploit them. After the siege of Vienna in 1529, the Ottomans did not retreat into isolation. Instead, they intensified their campaigns. Hungary, the contested heartland of Central Europe, became the primary battleground between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. With the death of King Louis II of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs, the kingdom fell into disarray. A Hungarian noble, John Zapolya, aligned himself with Suleiman, recognizing Ottoman suzerainty in exchange for support against the Habsburgs. This angered Charles V and Ferdinand I, who sought to install Ferdinand as the rightful ruler of Hungary. For decades, the region saw a bitter tug-of-war between the two powers. Suleiman personally led multiple campaigns to reinforce Ottoman rule in Hungary, besieging Habsburg fortresses and ensuring that Ottoman influence remained strong. The key cities of Buda and Pest were firmly under Ottoman control, turning Hungary into a strategic base for future incursions into Europe. The Habsburgs, despite their struggles, were not passive adversaries. Ferdinand I, though less militarily gifted than his brother Charles, was a persistent and strategic ruler. He continuously sought alliances with German princes, the papacy, and Spain to counter Ottoman expansion. Though he could not defeat Suleiman outright, he ensured that the Ottoman advance into Central Europe remained a slow and costly process. One of the most significant confrontations occurred in 1532 at the Siege of Kasheg. The Ottoman army, numbering over 100,000 soldiers, marched once again toward Vienna. However, at Kasheg, a small Habsburg garrison led by Nikola Jurisic held out against the overwhelming Ottoman force. Though the fortress was ultimately bypassed, the delay gave the Habsburgs enough time to reinforce Vienna, preventing another direct siege. Suleiman, seeing the obstacles ahead, turned back. It was a minor event in the grand scope of war, but it symbolized the resilience of the Habsburgs. They would not be easily broken. As the conflict continued, diplomacy played as much of a role as military strength. By the 1540s, both empires realized that an outright conquest of the other was unlikely. The wars had drained resources, and new threats were emerging. Spain was expanding its dominance in the New World, Protestant movements were weakening Catholic unity in Europe, and the Safavid Empire threatened the Ottomans in the East. In 1547, a truce was signed between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. The terms were favorable to Suleiman. Ferdinand agreed to pay an annual tribute in exchange for being recognized as the ruler of the Habsburg-controlled parts of Hungary. Though temporary, this treaty marked a significant moment. The Habsburgs had essentially admitted Ottoman superiority, at least for the time being. But peace was always fragile. The treaty did not last long, and by the 1550s, war erupted once again. Suleiman, now an aging but still determined ruler, launched another Hungarian campaign in 1566, laying siege to the fortress of Szigetvar. The defense was led by the legendary Croatian commander Nikola Subic Zrinski, who and his men fought with unmatched bravery. In a dramatic last stand, the defenders launched a final charge against the Ottomans before being overwhelmed. Though the city fell, the campaign proved costly. It was here, during the siege, that Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent passed away. The great conqueror, who had spent his life expanding and defending the Ottoman Empire, died before seeing the final victory. His death was kept a secret for weeks to maintain army morale, but his passing marked the end of an era. His son, Selim II, would take the throne, but the war with the Habsburgs had reached a stalemate. Despite never fully conquering Central Europe, Suleiman had fundamentally altered the balance of power. The Habsburgs had been forced into a defensive position, unable to expand eastward. Hungary remained divided, with the Ottomans ruling most of it for over 150 years. The wars had demonstrated the strength and resilience of both empires, ensuring that neither could fully defeat the other. The struggle between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs was more than just a military conflict. It was a clash of civilizations, a test of endurance, and a defining feature of European history. Though the fighting continued under Suleiman's successors, the balance of power had been established. The Ottomans would dominate the Balkans and Hungary, while the Habsburgs would hold their remaining territories, always wary of another Ottoman advance. Suleiman may not have conquered Vienna, but his wars against the Habsburgs reshaped the course of European history, ensuring that the Ottoman Empire remained a dominant force for centuries to come. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was not just an Ottoman ruler, he was a force that reshaped the very structure of European politics. His campaigns pushed the limits of Ottoman expansion, striking deep into Central Europe, dominating the Mediterranean, and bringing some of the most powerful Christian states to their knees. But the question remains, how close did Suleiman come to conquering Europe? Could history have taken a different turn if just a few battles had gone differently? By the time Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520, the Ottomans were already a dominant empire, but the Sultan saw greater possibilities. He envisioned an empire stretching into the heart of Europe, rivaling Rome itself. His campaigns into Hungary and Austria were meant to break Christian resistance and establish Ottoman rule deep within the continent. The fall of Belgrade 1521 and the crushing victory at Mohacs 1526 signaled the beginning of this grand ambition. The Ottomans had dismantled the Hungarian monarchy in a single battle, leaving the door to Central Europe wide open. But despite these early successes, one fortress stood in the way: Vienna. If Vienna had fallen, the road to Germany, Italy, and beyond could have been open to Ottoman rule. The siege of Vienna in 1529 was Suleiman's greatest attempt to bring the Habsburgs to their knees. His army, estimated at 120,000 soldiers, marched through Hungary, sweeping through Habsburg-held territory like a storm. But as the siege dragged on, the harsh autumn rains, supply shortages, and determined defenders made victory impossible. With winter approaching, Suleiman was forced to withdraw, marking a turning point in Ottoman expansion. Still, the Sultan did not abandon his European ambitions. In 1532, he launched another campaign, again setting his sights on Austria. But this time, the small fortress of Kasheg, defended by just 800 men, delayed the Ottoman advance long enough for the Habsburgs to reinforce Vienna. Once more, Europe had been spared conquest, not by overwhelming force, but by luck, weather, and desperate last stands. Yet, military strength alone was not the only reason the Ottomans failed to take more of Europe. Politics played an equally crucial role. Unlike the Habsburgs, who ruled through a vast but often fragmented web of alliances, the Ottomans relied on direct military control. This meant that every newly conquered territory required the presence of an Ottoman governor, garrisons, and administrative networks, resources that were stretched thin the further they moved westward. The more land they took, the harder it became to govern effectively. Moreover, Europe was not as weak as it seemed. Though divided by internal conflicts, such as the Protestant Reformation, Christian rulers understood the existential threat the Ottomans posed. The Habsburgs, despite suffering numerous defeats, adapted their strategy. They focused on fortified defenses, making it harder for Ottoman armies to advance quickly. They also leveraged alliances with the papacy, Spain, and German states, creating a united Christian resistance that kept the Ottomans from achieving a breakthrough. Another key factor was the shift in European warfare. While the Ottomans had dominated land battles for much of Suleiman's reign, European armies were developing new military technologies and strategies. The increasing use of firearms, artillery, and defensive fortifications made sieges more difficult. Unlike the early 16th century, when Ottoman cavalry could overwhelm traditional medieval armies, the late 1500s saw the rise of more organized, gunpowder-based warfare, which posed a challenge to Ottoman military tactics. Logistics also played a decisive role. Unlike in the Balkans or Anatolia, where the Ottomans had strong supply networks, Western Europe presented longer, riskier supply lines. Every campaign required massive amounts of food, ammunition, and reinforcements, which became increasingly difficult to transport across enemy-held territory. The more extended the war effort became, the harder it was to sustain. Furthermore, the Ottoman Empire faced threats on multiple fronts. While Suleiman was engaged in Europe, the Safavids in Persia continued to be a major concern. War with the Safavids drained Ottoman resources and forced Suleiman to split his military focus. If the empire had only faced European powers, perhaps more significant gains could have been made. But balancing conflicts in Hungary, the Mediterranean, and Persia made sustained conquest impossible. By the later years of Suleiman's reign, it was clear that the conquest of Europe was no longer realistic. While the Ottomans controlled vast territories in Hungary and the Balkans, further advances were met with greater resistance. The wars against the Habsburgs reached a stalemate, with neither side able to achieve total victory. Still, while the Ottomans may not have conquered Europe in the way Suleiman envisioned, their influence remained undeniable. The wars of Suleiman's reign reshaped European geopolitics, forcing Christian states to strengthen their defenses, unite under new alliances, and develop military innovations to counter the Ottomans. The balance of power that emerged from these conflicts would last for centuries, ensuring that Europe remained divided, rather than falling under a single empire's rule. Suleiman may not have placed an Ottoman banner in Vienna or beyond, but he changed the course of European history forever. His campaigns forced European rulers to adapt, pushed the Ottomans to the height of their military power, and ensured that the struggle between East and West would continue long after his death. Sultan Suleiman's reign was a defining period in the history of Europe and the Ottoman Empire. His wars reshaped borders, altered alliances, and left a lasting impact that extended far beyond his time. Though he never conquered all of Europe, his campaigns ensured that the Ottomans remained one of the most powerful empires for centuries. The question is not just what he achieved, but how his military endeavors influenced the world long after his passing. By the time of Suleiman's death in 1566, the Ottoman Empire had reached its peak in terms of territorial expansion, military might, and global influence. His conquests in Hungary, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean had pushed Ottoman power deep into Europe. While he failed to take Vienna or completely crush the Habsburgs, he permanently changed the political landscape. Central Europe could no longer afford to ignore the Ottomans, and Christian rulers had to adapt to their presence on the European stage. One of Suleiman's most significant impacts was the way he forced Europe to modernize its military and defensive strategies. Before his campaigns, European armies were often divided and relied on outdated medieval warfare. But his relentless invasions forced the Habsburgs, Spanish, and other Christian states to fortify their cities, reorganize their armies, and develop better weaponry. The Ottoman military machine was powerful, but it also accelerated Europe's transition into modern warfare. At the same time, Suleiman's naval dominance reshaped control over the Mediterranean. Under his rule, the Ottomans, led by Barbarossa and other skilled admirals, secured key naval victories that challenged European powers like Spain and Venice. The rise of the Ottoman navy ensured that the Mediterranean remained a battleground for control, leading to further naval advancements and shaping global trade routes. However, Suleiman's ambitions also revealed the limits of Ottoman expansion. His wars drained resources, stretched supply lines, and forced the empire to fight on multiple fronts. The failure to take Vienna and the prolonged struggles against the Habsburgs showed that while the Ottomans were a formidable force, they could not conquer Europe outright. Instead, the empire settled into a balance of power with Christian Europe, a balance that defined Ottoman-European relations for the next several centuries. Beyond warfare, Suleiman's reign also influenced diplomacy and political alliances. His alliances with France and other European states against the Habsburgs demonstrated that religion was not the only factor in global politics. European rulers learned that alliances could be based on mutual interests rather than just religious affiliation. This shift in diplomatic thinking would later influence European geopolitics, leading to more strategic partnerships and realpolitik approaches in global conflicts. Internally, Suleiman's military campaigns also shaped the administrative and economic structure of the Ottoman Empire. The vast lands he conquered had to be governed, leading to the expansion of Ottoman bureaucracy, taxation systems, and military recruitment. However, the strain of constant warfare meant that maintaining these territories became increasingly difficult. The need to sustain a large standing army and continuous military campaigns placed financial pressures on the empire. Perhaps most importantly, Suleiman's wars helped define the Ottoman Empire's identity. His reign became a golden age of military, cultural, and political power, and his legacy became a source of inspiration for later Ottoman rulers. Even after his death, the empire remained one of the most influential forces in the world, in part due to the foundations he had laid through his military conquests. In the end, Suleiman's wars were not just battles for land. They were battles for influence, legacy, and the future of both the Ottoman Empire and Europe. While he did not conquer all of Europe, he left behind an empire that stood as a dominant power for centuries. His military campaigns reshaped the world, and the echoes of his victories and struggles can still be felt in history today.